I never imagined the man I trusted the most, my own father, could shatter my life in an instant. But that night, in the silence of our home, everything changed. His gentle words turned chilling, and his comforting presence became my deepest fear. I was frozen, unable to scream, unable to escape. What do you do when the person meant to protect you becomes your greatest nightmare? Growing up, my life was the picture of simplicity and love, or so I thought. My mother, Claire, was the heart of our family, her warmth and laughter filling every corner of our home. She had a knack for making everyone feel special, remembering the smallest details that could brighten your day. My father, Jack, was quieter, a man of few words but steady in his presence. Together, they seemed to balance each other perfectly. Sunday nights were our tradition, family movie nights with bowls of popcorn that were often burnt but always delicious. Those moments felt so normal, so safe, that I couldn't imagine life without them. But life has a way of pulling the rug out from under you when you least expect it. When my mother fell ill, it was like watching the sun set and knowing it wouldn't rise again. Her illness wasn't sudden, it was slow and cruel, taking her from us piece by piece. I was only 16, and in some ways I had to grow up overnight. My father and I clung to each other in those months, leaning on what little strength we had left. When she passed, it felt like the world shifted on its axis. Nothing was the same. The house, once filled with her laughter, became unbearably quiet. My father changed too. He stopped going to work regularly, spent more time at home, and withdrew into himself. I tried to comfort him, thinking we were both grieving in our own ways. His hugs became tighter, longer, almost desperate. At the time, I thought it was his way of holding on to the only family he had left. Looking back, the signs were there, small, almost unnoticeable things that I brushed off. His gaze lingering a little too long, the way his hand would rest on my shoulder a second longer than it should. I told myself it was nothing, just a grieving father trying to find his footing. But deep down, something didn't feel right. For a while, I clung to the illusion that we were helping each other heal. But the cracks in our relationship were already forming, hidden behind the veneer of shared loss. And I had no idea how quickly those cracks would shatter everything. At first, I chalked everything up to grief. Losing my mom had left a void so vast it felt impossible to fill. My dad's quiet demeanor shifted into something more intense, more focused. I noticed the changes in him, but I convinced myself it was just his way of coping. After all, wasn't I changing too? Grief doesn't come with a rulebook, and I thought we were simply trying to survive in our own broken ways. But as time passed, his actions became harder to ignore. He stopped leaving the house entirely, as if the outside world no longer existed. He would sit in the living room, staring at old photos of my mom for hours. At first, it felt endearing, proof of how deeply he loved her. But then his attention shifted. He started watching me, his gaze lingering in ways that made my skin crawl. The first time I noticed, I dismissed it. I thought maybe I was imagining things, projecting my own discomfort onto him. But the moments kept piling up. He would brush my hair off my face, his hand lingering just a second too long. He started complimenting me in ways that felt different. "You're so beautiful," he'd say, his voice soft and almost reverent. People had always said I resembled my mother, but the way he said it felt heavy, weighted with something I couldn't quite name. I began to avoid him, retreating to my room as soon as I got home from school. I'd lock the door, turning up music to drown out the silence of the house. But no matter how much I tried to escape, the tension seemed to follow me. The once safe walls of our home now felt oppressive, closing in on me with every passing day. One evening, I came home to find him sitting on the couch, staring at nothing. The TV was on, but he wasn't watching it. "Valerie," he said when he noticed me, his voice low and strange. "Come sit with me." I hesitated, every instinct telling me to keep my distance. But he was my dad. I couldn't just ignore him, could I? I sat down, keeping a safe distance between us. He turned to look at me, his eyes glassy and tired. "You remind me so much of her," he said, his voice breaking. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and stared at the TV, praying the moment would pass. But it didn't. He reached out, tucking a strand of my hair behind my ear. "You have her eyes," he murmured. My stomach twisted, a knot of fear and confusion tightening with every word. I wanted to pull away, but I was frozen, unsure of what to do or say. Over the next few weeks, his behavior grew more unpredictable. He would appear in doorways unexpectedly, his gaze intense and unsettling. He started asking me to spend more time with him, watching movies, eating dinner together, even just sitting in silence. I tried to refuse, making excuses about schoolwork or needing to meet friends, but he always found a way to make me feel guilty. "Don't you want to help me?" he'd say, his voice soft but insistent. "We're all we have left now." His words haunted me. I felt trapped, caught between wanting to support him and the nagging feeling that something was deeply wrong. I started avoiding friends, too ashamed to explain why I couldn't invite them over or why I flinched at the mention of family. I felt like I was drowning, each day pulling me further under. The tipping point came late one night. I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my room. My heart pounded as I stared at the locked door, the shadows shifting beneath it. "Valerie," he called softly. "Are you awake?" I didn't respond, my breath caught in my throat. The doorknob rattled, and for a moment, I thought he might force it open. But then he stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with the unspoken tension that now defined our lives. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was very, very wrong. I wish I could say that night was the end of it, that my instincts to avoid him would protect me. But it wasn't. In the days that followed, the strange tension between us only grew. Every interaction felt loaded, as though there were unspoken words hanging in the air, threatening to suffocate me. It started subtly. He would find reasons to touch me. A hand on my shoulder that lingered too long, a brush of his fingers as he passed me in the hallway. Each time, I felt my skin crawl, but I convinced myself it was nothing. He's just grieving, I told myself. He's just lonely. I wanted so desperately to believe that, to cling to the version of my father I had always known. But the moments grew harder to ignore. One evening, as we sat on the couch, he turned to me with a look I couldn't decipher. "You've grown up so much," he said, his voice soft. "You're not a little girl anymore." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I forced a smile, muttered something about homework, and quickly excused myself. My heart raced as I climbed the stairs to my room, locking the door behind me. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe I was imagining things, letting my own grief twist his actions into something they weren't. But deep down I knew better. There was a shift in the air, a subtle but undeniable change that I couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. The next incident came on a quiet Saturday evening. We had just finished dinner, and I was washing the dishes when he came up behind me. His hand rested on my shoulder, and I froze. "Let's watch a movie," he said, his voice casual. "Just the two of us." I wanted to refuse, to come up with an excuse, but I couldn't find the words. So I nodded, drying my hands and following him into the living room. I sat at the far end of the couch, keeping as much distance as possible. But as the movie played, he slid closer. At first, it was subtle, a shift in his seat, a stretch of his arm. Then his hand found its way to my leg. My body tensed, a knot of panic tightening in my chest. I wanted to move, to tell him to stop, but I couldn't. My voice felt trapped in my throat, and I sat there frozen as his hand lingered. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I snapped out of my paralysis, pulling away and standing abruptly. "I'm tired," I mumbled, avoiding his gaze. "I'm going to bed." I didn't wait for a response, rushing up the stairs and locking my door behind me. I leaned against it, my heart pounding as tears filled my eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt his hand on my leg, heard his voice echoing in my mind. The safety I had once felt in my home was gone, replaced by a constant sense of dread. I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal, but I didn't know what to do. Who could I tell? Who would believe me? The worst part was how he acted afterward. He behaved as though nothing had happened, as though the lines he had crossed didn't exist. At breakfast the next morning, he asked if I wanted to go out for ice cream, his tone light and cheerful. It was as if he was testing me, waiting to see if I would say anything. I didn't. I couldn't. Over the next few weeks, his behavior became more calculated. He stopped pretending, stopped hiding the way he looked at me or the way he touched me. It was always under the guise of something innocent, a hug that lasted too long, a hand brushing my hair out of my face. But there was nothing innocent about it. Each touch felt heavier, more deliberate, as though he was pushing boundaries to see how far he could go. The tension between us grew unbearable. I started avoiding him entirely, spending as much time as I could at school or at the library. But no matter how hard I tried to escape, I couldn't. Every time I came home, the same dread awaited me. One night, I was sitting at the kitchen table, finishing a school project, when he came up behind me. "You're working so hard," he said, his voice low. He placed his hands on my shoulders, massaging them gently. My stomach churned, but I stayed still, too afraid to react. You deserve to relax, he continued, his hands moving lower. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain calm. I need to finish this, I said quickly, standing up and gathering my papers. I'll work in my room. He didn't stop me, but the look in his eyes as I walked away made my skin crawl. It was a look of possession, of control, and it terrified me. That night, I stared at the ceiling, tears streaming down my face as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I felt trapped, helpless, and utterly alone. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to make it stop. But I couldn't. The weight of his presence, of his actions, kept me rooted in place, too afraid to fight back. It was a cold, silent night when everything finally came to a head. The house felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were bracing for what was about to unfold. I had spent the entire day dreading the inevitable, replaying his words and touches in my mind. I felt like a prisoner, trapped in a cycle I couldn't escape, no matter how much I wanted to. That night, I locked my door as usual, hoping the simple barrier would keep me safe. But I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made my heart race. I lay awake, staring at the faint moonlight on my ceiling, when I heard it, the soft sound of footsteps outside my room. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, my eyes fixed on the doorknob. It rattled once, then again. "Valerie," his voice came low and strained. "Let me in. I just want to talk." I froze, my body trembling as fear coursed through me. "It's late, Dad," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "We can talk tomorrow." But he didn't go away. Instead, I heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. My stomach dropped. I had forgotten he kept a spare key for emergencies. The door creaked open, and there he stood, silhouetted by the dim hallway light. "I can't wait until tomorrow," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something. But I was frozen, trapped between fear and disbelief. "Please, Dad," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Don't." He didn't listen. His steps were slow, deliberate, as he moved closer to the bed. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need each other. We're all we have now." His words made my stomach churn, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but the options felt impossibly limited. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair from my face. "You remind me so much of her," he murmured, his eyes glassy. Panic surged through me, and I bolted upright, pulling away from his touch. "This isn't right," I cried, my voice breaking. "You're my father." His expression darkened for a moment before softening into something that almost looked like sadness. "I know," he said, his voice low. "But you don't understand what it's like to be alone. To lose everything. That doesn't make this okay." I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "You promised it would stop." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of my words hanging between us. Then he stood, his face unreadable. "You don't mean that," he said quietly. "You're just upset. You'll see that this is what we need." Before I could respond, he turned and left the room, closing the door behind him. I sat there, shaking, as the reality of what had just happened settled over me. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't stay in this house, in this life. Something had to change. The next morning, I made my decision. As soon as he left for his usual Sunday errands, I packed a bag, stuffing it with clothes and anything else I could grab in a hurry. My hands shook as I zipped it shut, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I didn't have a plan, but I knew I couldn't stay. I left the house without looking back, my heart pounding as I walked to the train station. Every step felt like a gamble, every passing car like a potential threat. But I kept moving, driven by the desperate need to escape. When I finally boarded the train, I collapsed into a seat, tears streaming down my face. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope, a faint light in the darkness. I went to the only place I could think of, Samara's dorm. When she opened the door and saw me standing there, her expression shifted from surprise to concern. "Valerie," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "What's going on?" I couldn't find the words to explain, so I didn't try. Instead, I collapsed into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. She held me, her arms strong and comforting, as I let out everything I had been holding in for so long. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice steady. "You're safe now. Take your time." It took hours before I could tell her what had happened. Even then, the words felt foreign and heavy on my tongue. I told her about my mom's death, about the changes in my dad, and about the things I had endured. She listened without interrupting, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and anger. "You don't have to go back there," she said firmly when I finished. "We'll figure this out. You're not alone." Her words were like a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge of despair. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back. Over the next few days, Samara helped me navigate the next steps. She encouraged me to reach out to a counselor and helped me file a report with the authorities. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it was also the most liberating. Speaking out felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I thought I had lost forever. The fallout was messy and painful. My father denied everything, of course, and the legal process was grueling. But through it all, I found strength in the support of the people around me. Samara, my counselor, and even strangers who heard my story stood by me, reminding me that I wasn't alone. The discovery of my father's betrayal was the darkest moment of my life, but it was also the turning point. It forced me to confront the truth, to stop pretending, and to start fighting for myself. And while the scars will always remain, they are a testament to my survival. A reminder that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, there is always a way forward. Leaving my father's house was only the beginning of the battle. The weight of what I had endured didn't vanish the moment I stepped out the door. If anything, it grew heavier. Every step forward was shadowed by doubt, fear, and the looming question of what came next. But I knew one thing: I couldn't go back. Samara became my rock in those first few weeks. She offered me a place to stay, a shoulder to cry on, and an unwavering presence that made me feel, for the first time in years, that I wasn't alone. Yet even in her warmth, I struggled. The shame was suffocating, a constant whisper in the back of my mind. I questioned every decision, replaying the events in my head and wondering if I could have done something differently to stop it. The hardest part came when Samara convinced me to seek professional help. Sitting in a counselor's office, the fluorescent lights humming softly above, I felt exposed in a way I never had before. The words wouldn't come at first. I stared at the floor, my hands gripping the edges of the chair, as the counselor waited patiently. Finally, I forced myself to speak, the truth spilling out in broken pieces. Saying it aloud felt like ripping open a wound I'd tried to ignore, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. For so long, I had carried the burden alone, convinced that no one would understand or believe me. But as I told my story, I saw no judgment in the counselor's eyes, only compassion and a quiet determination to help me heal. Reporting my father to the authorities was another hurdle I wasn't sure I could face. The thought of reliving everything in front of strangers, of having to prove my pain, terrified me. But Samara stood by my side, holding my hand as I made the call. "You're not doing this alone," she told me. Her words gave me the strength to keep going. The legal process was brutal. My father denied everything, painting me as a confused and troubled girl seeking attention. His words cut deep, reopening wounds I was still trying to close. But for every lie he told, I found the courage to speak the truth. With the help of my counselor, I provided the authorities with detailed accounts, ensuring that my voice wouldn't be silenced again. The aftermath of his arrest was a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of loss battled for dominance. Despite everything he had done, a part of me mourned the father I had once believed him to be. The man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had held my hand when I was scared, was gone, replaced by the monster who had stolen my innocence. Accepting that duality was one of the hardest parts of my healing journey. The impact of his actions rippled through every aspect of my life. Trust became a foreign concept, and the simplest interactions felt fraught with danger. I found myself pulling away from people, flinching at casual touches and avoiding eye contact. Even with Samara, the one person who had stood by me through it all, I struggled to let my guard down completely. I wanted to trust her, to believe in the safety she offered, but the scars my father left behind made it difficult. Despite the challenges, I slowly began to rebuild. Therapy became a lifeline, a place where I could untangle the web of guilt, shame, and anger that had consumed me. I learned to separate myself from his actions, to understand that what he did was not my fault. The process was slow and painful, but each small step felt like a victory. Samara's unwavering support was another crucial piece of my recovery. She never pushed me to heal faster than I was ready, instead offering quiet encouragement and endless patience. Her belief in me helped me believe in myself, even on the days when I wanted to give up. The hardest part was confronting the question of forgiveness. People often talk about forgiveness as a path to healing, but for me it felt impossible. How could I forgive the man who had destroyed my sense of safety, who had turned my own home into a prison? I wrestled with the idea for months, trying to reconcile the need for closure with the impossibility of absolution. In the end, I realized that forgiveness wasn't the answer. Forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for me. It didn't mean excusing his actions or forgetting what he had done. It meant letting go of the power he still held over me, releasing the anger and pain so I could move forward. It was a decision I made for myself, not for him. As the months turned into a year, I found moments of peace in the chaos. I threw myself into school, channeling my pain into something productive. I joined a support group for survivors, where I met others who had faced similar experiences. Their stories gave me hope, reminding me that healing was possible, even after the darkest of nights. The fallout of my father's actions will always be a part of my story, a shadow that lingers on the edges of my life. But it no longer defines me. I've learned that survival isn't just about escaping. It's about finding the strength to rebuild, to reclaim the parts of yourself that were stolen. It's about finding light in the darkness, even when it feels impossible. To anyone watching this, to anyone who feels trapped or alone, please know this. You are not defined by what has happened to you. There is a way out, and there are people who care. You are stronger than you realize, and your story doesn't have to end in silence. Healing isn't a straight line. It's a winding path full of setbacks, unexpected emotions, and moments where it feels like you're right back at the beginning. For me, it was a journey of learning to live again, to trust again, and to redefine who I was outside of the pain I had endured. After months of therapy, support groups, and leaning on the few people I trusted, I began to find pieces of myself that I thought were gone forever. My love for reading returned, offering an escape from the heaviness that had consumed my life. I started journaling, pouring my emotions onto paper as a way to process the chaos inside me. Each word felt like a small step forward, a tiny piece of control reclaimed. Samara remained by my side through it all, her patience and unwavering support a constant source of strength. She never rushed me or tried to force me to heal on her timeline. Instead, she celebrated every small victory, whether it was making it through a day without tears, speaking up in a support group, or even just smiling again. Her presence reminded me that love and kindness still existed in the world, even after everything I had been through. Through therapy, I learned to let go of the guilt that had weighed me down for so long. What happened wasn't my fault. I didn't cause it, and I didn't deserve it. Those words were hard to say at first, let alone believe, but over time, they became my truth. Repeating them to myself felt like unraveling the lies my father had tried to weave into my mind. Forgiveness was a more complicated matter. I wrestled with the concept for months, torn between the desire to let go and the impossibility of absolution. In the end, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing his actions or forgetting what he had done. It was about freeing myself from the hold his memory had on me. I didn't need to forgive him for his sake. I needed to forgive him for mine. It was a quiet decision, a moment of clarity that allowed me to finally begin moving forward. One of the most powerful lessons I learned was that healing doesn't mean erasing the pain or pretending it never happened. It means carrying the scars with you, not as a mark of weakness, but as a testament to your strength. My scars remind me of what I've overcome, of the resilience I never knew I had. In time, I began to trust again. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. But little by little, I let people into my life, friends, mentors, and even strangers who offered kindness when I needed it most. Each connection felt like a risk, but it also felt like a victory. My journey isn't over, and it never will be. There will always be moments when the memories resurface, when the darkness threatens to creep back in. But I've learned to face those moments with courage, to remind myself of how far I've come and how much I've grown. I've learned that survival isn't just about escaping. It's about reclaiming your life piece by piece and finding joy again, even in the smallest things. To anyone watching this, I want you to know that you are not alone. There is no shame in your pain, and there is no weakness in seeking help. You are stronger than you realize, and there is a way forward, even when it feels like there isn't. Speak up, reach out, and don't let fear silence you. Life after betrayal is possible. Healing is possible, and so is love, connection, and hope. The road may be long and difficult, but it is worth traveling. You deserve to live a life free from fear, filled with light, and defined by the strength you've discovered within yourself. If you've ever felt trapped or silenced, Know that your story matters and there is hope. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in her situation? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories of resilience and survival. Together, we can create a space for healing and understanding. Stay tuned for our next story. You won't believe what's coming next.